Hello there, this is Dean Curry again for Fantasy Football RSVP. We are going to be talking today about drafting strategies. I'd like to think of myself as someone that has successfully, every fantasy football season for the NFL, I have successfully in every league pulled off anywhere from 6 to 10 trades in one fantasy football season per league. That's not overall. There is actually an art to trading with other players that works very effectively. And most of the time, believe it or not, if I put out 20 trade proposals, 10 of them get accepted, if not more, maybe 14 of 20. Something to that degree. The reason why is I always put trades out there that make both teams stronger. That's really the key. A lot of people are I always laugh when people put two mediocre players, they think two mediocre players equals a superstar. Okay? And when you send trades like that out, it does a couple of things that are really bad. Okay? You're basically telling the other team that you really don't care about their roster and about them doing well. And I know it's a competition and you're playing against each other, but when you make a trade proposal, it has to be in the best interest of both parties. Okay? So the first thing you want to do when you're making a trade is you probably already understand the players that you would like to unload on your team. But before you even get into that, you should look at a team's players that are attractive to you, okay? And let's say it's 2 players or 3 players. I've done trades of 8 players, 4 from my team, 4 from the other team. I've pulled off trades with 10-player trades. I've pulled off trades that involve players like Antonio Brown, Zeke Elliott, Kareem Hunt, DeAndre Hopkins. They say certain players are not tradable, Kamara. Certain players are not tradable. It's not true. Let me give you an example. I recently, before we get into that, let me just go back to the process of trading and how to be successful. First, find a team that has players that you like, okay? Second, find out what that team's deficit is. Are they weak on running backs? Are they weak on quarterbacks? Are they weak on wide receivers? Sometimes, they might be thin on running backs and you may not have running backs they want. A good thing to do is go on the waiver wire and pick up a running back that had a great week last week that's still out there, and then use them as trade bait. I've done that many times. It's worked very effectively. But you look at a team and you try to find out where there's a deficit, maybe at running back. And what you try to do is you try to formulate a team where the team you're trading to will actually get stronger and get more balance on their team. Then you, of course, want to look at, your team and the traders that you're trying to get rid of. But, basically what people do is they try to just get rid of the players that they don't want anymore, and they're not even looking at the other team to see if that's, if the other team could benefit from these players. They just want to unload. I can't tell you again how many times I get 2 mediocre players does not equal a superstar. Okay? 2 very good players equals a superstar. And 9 times out of 10 I get trade proposals, and they say anytime you get a trade proposal you should counter and not just say no and then move on. I actually believe that, but you may have to counter with an entirely different trade if the trade is bogus or they're trying to give you 2 average players for a superstar Two average players don't equal a superstar. Two good players don't equal a superstar. Only two very good players equals a superstar. But it has to be in the best interest of that team. Look at the matchups. See, where that team, needs, a player. Maybe that team you're trading to has two players on a bye week next week, two wide receivers. So if you send them a trade proposal with a good wide receiver, it could cover their bye week. And a lot of people will do trades because they need a win on a short term. Second and third, and this is, okay, so the first is you look at a team that has players you want. Second, you look at the team's weaknesses. Okay, and you try to fill that slot, whether it be with your team or picking up a player on waiver wire in order to, make a trade as trade bait. Third, and most importantly, you always want to make a trade where it appears, and this is a tricky part, it appears that they're getting the better end of the deal. I mean, you want it to be fair because in my fantasy football league, we only two votes actually nullify a trade. And I set it up that way so two people could just vote no and, it's done and there's nothing anybody can do. Very little interference from the commissioner, which is me. But two votes is very easy to get two votes against. But you want to make a trade that it appears as if the other player is getting the better end of the deal. Let's see if I could give you a recent example. I traded, believe it or not, I traded Adam Thielen. And I know you're all going to think, like, how could you trade Thielen? That's, the dumbest thing in the world to do. But it's not, okay? Because I keep getting beat pretty badly because in my league, we have a running back, a wide receiver slot, and 3 flex spots. And most of the time, if you have really good receivers, it's better to play a receiver than a running back in your 3 flex spots because it's becoming, more of a passing league. And if you look at all the highest scores, there are more wide receivers in there than running backs. And there's less and less running backs to pick from with platoons and things like that. So, the bottom line is I like to play 3 wide receivers, unless it's a catching running back that is like maybe a Tariq Cohen or obviously a Kamara. I was trying to give you examples of people that aren't on Kamara's playing field. But a running back that actually, maybe gets 40 or 50 yards a game running and maybe 4 or 5 catches for 50 yards. But, it's harder and harder to find running backs that do that other than the superstars like Kamara or Gurley or Barkley. But, there's just a handful of players like that you could rely on. Kareem Hunt, someone I traded recently, wasn't catching the ball at all. And now the last couple of weeks, they're throwing to him a little bit more. But we all know people that had Kareem Hunt last year is sometimes he puts up 3 or 4 really, or, great weeks. And then all of a sudden, with Andy Reid and the way, he does things, sometimes Kareem Hunt, like last year, he put up 3 or 4 weeks in a row, which were pretty bad. So it's hard to gauge exactly what's going on there, but he has been catching the ball a little bit more. But when I traded him, he wasn't, and it looked like he just wasn't going to be thrown to that much. Of course, he just played a couple of soft defenses, so you got to be careful there and keep your eye on him. But you always want it to appear as if the team you're trading to is getting the better end of the deal. For example, I play my wide receiver in a wide receiver spot and 3 wide receivers in my 3 flex spots. Okay? But I kept getting disappointed by my not my starting wide receiver in 2 out of the 3 flex spots, which were wide receivers. But in those 3 flex spots, I had 3 wide receivers, and 2 would perform and 1 would not. And, that was making me lose a couple of weeks in a row. I really needed a solid fourth wide receiver because I had three good ones. I had Tyler Boyd. He had a couple of good weeks, but I know never to trust Dalton because every year that guy disappoints me in one way or another. It's amazing he's still the starter on the Bengals because, and then people ask like, oh, they've never won a playoff game, and it's like, yeah, because this guy in every single big game, Andy Dalton folds. He plays well when it doesn't count, but when it's a game they need or it's a pressure point of the game, the guy folds every time. And, I watched the game last week. Of course, I had Boyd in there. And, I'm watching this guy go throw back. And sure, he threw to A.J. Green like 15 or 16 times. But, it was a perfect game for Boyd. And I'm watching, the unreliable Andy Dalton drop back and just every time try to throw to A.J. Green. And yeah, he's a great receiver and all, but every single time he's throwing it to A.J. Green. I'm like, my God, this guy is double covered. Once he was triple covered. And I think, out of 15 or 16, attempts, he maybe had, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7, receptions. And that's the thing with AJ Green is people say, he's a great receiver to have. A lot of times I don't have him because, he puts up big numbers. But what you have to understand, the guy is thrown to like over a dozen times. Like sometimes he has 14, 15 targets. But if you look at his receptions, especially for this year in 2018, he has like 5 receptions, 6 receptions. So he's getting 5 or 6 receptions out of like 15, throws to him. And it basically kills the other receivers because a couple of plays I could actually see Boyd open. And, Dalton's just going back, trying to throw to A.J. Green every single time, which makes Dalton a horrible play quarterback. And, you can't just throw it to one player every single time when he's doubled and triple teamed. I should have racked up last week. But anyway, I had to get rid of Boyd because he lost me points like 2 weeks in a row. If I had a decent third receiver in the flex spot, I would have won. Both weeks I lost by less than a handful of points, just a few points. So, yes, I traded the great Adam Thielen for to get Ashlyn Jeffrey, Emmanuel Sanders, which two really reliable receivers. So let's see, I have Sanders, got rid of Boyd, Sanders, Jeffrey, Landry, and Stephon Diggs. So I got Stephon Diggs. In the trade, I got Stephon Diggs, Sanders, and Jeffrey, and I gave away Boyd, and I gave away Thielen, and a couple of arbitrary running backs. I think I gave away Marlon Mack, but I'm stacked at running backs, so it's no big deal for me to give Max. He's never going to play anyway because I have other running backs, Cohen, Zeke Elliott, that, Kerryon Johnson. I just have other running backs on my team, so I have no need for Marlon Mack, and I think I threw in another running back. I think I threw in another, average running back. But the key is I got rid of Boyd. I got rid of Thielen. But I got Jeffrey, Sanders, and Diggs. And what a lot of people don't understand, it's like Diggs, we're in week 8 now. Yeah, Diggs, put up 2 low points the last 2 weeks. But you don't pay attention to something like that because, after Thielen is just putting up ridiculous numbers, defenses adjust. They're going to start covering Thielen more. And what a lot of people also don't realize is Diggs is a lot of times, covered by the best corner. He has some favorable matchups coming up, including this week. And second, up until week 8, basically up until maybe the last week or so, Minnesota's defense was awful, and they had no running game. So they weren't getting as many opportunities, which they will get more opportunities because the defense is starting to play well and come together. And even though Dalvin Cook is out, they've started to really establish a running game with Murray. And so, defense playing well, getting more opportunities, the running game, garnering more attention is only going to, make defenses have to adjust to that, which will be more opportunities for Diggs. Thielen is going to start getting a lot more attention because there's a reason why, guys don't put up 100 yards every single week like Thielen has. He's breaking some record now. But defenses will adjust to that, which will leave Diggs more open. And what you really have to pay attention to is, I bought Diggs low. And that's the whole idea. You want to buy players when they're low. And, you don't look at how many yards he has and how many receptions. You look at how many targets. The last 2 weeks were Diggs' 2 worst weeks. But each time over the last 2 weeks, he was targeted over a dozen times. Last week, I think he was targeted 15 times. He only had like 4 or 5 receptions for like 30 or 40 yards. But he was targeted 15 times. And eventually, they're going to figure that out, between Cousins and Diggs, and you're going to see Diggs step up. But most importantly, there does come a time when you have to trade your best player. I'm right on the border of I'm in the playoffs right now, but I'm also a couple of more losses, and we have a short season. We only have 12 games in our season. So we only have 5 weeks left, and I'm kind of on the border of just making the playoffs. But if I lose another game or two, I could be in danger of being out of the playoffs. So every win is really important. I basically, in that trade, I traded away, I traded away 2 good receivers, Keenan Allen, who really isn't getting the ball a lot, and Thielen, for Sanders, Diggs. Diggs, who's the other one? Sanders, Diggs, and Jeffrey. I always forget him. So I traded away 2 good receivers, and, I watched the Charger game the other day, and he's just not throwing it to Allen. And they have a good running game. A lot of times they're ahead. Their defense is getting better and better with Bosa coming back. I mean, this team's going to run the ball a lot. And they throw a lot of dump-off passes to Gordon as well. So, and, Tyrell Williams, Mike Williams are starting to, come around, which is going to take even more plays away from Allen. So it really was essentially the time to unload him, before he has a really bad week. But you have to sometimes trade your 2 best players to get 3 really good players, because it's better balance for a team. I remember last year, a team, in my league asked me, like, how do I do it? How do I win my league every year? Or almost every year, or at least finish second, worst case. And, it's not luck. There's reasons why. It's like, you make these great trades, and how do you do it? So I basically helped him make a trade, and I think he was 0-4 or 0-5 to start the season, like 0 wins and 4 or 5 losses, and he wasn't going anywhere. But he had like Antonio Brown, so, and I think he had Julio Jones too. And I said, well, look, you have Antonio Brown, you have, Julio Jones, trade him. And he's like, I'm not going to trade those 2 players. Trade. I'm like, look, you're 0-5. You have 0 wins and 5 losses with Antonio Brown, and he might have even had Shady McCoy. And I told him to trade him too. I said, you have 3 good players, and this was last year. So Shady McCoy was actually a good fantasy player last year. At least in the beginning of the season, he was doing really well. Tailed off a little at the end, but anyway, I said trade Shady, Antonio Brown, and Julio Jones, because I said the rest of your team is horrible. And that's why you keep losing every week, because you have three good players and you have no balance on your team. And you could get rid of these three players and get like six players that are really solid, that you could, punch in and punch out. And I said before the bye weeks start setting in, you're going to have even less players. I said your bench is awful. You need depth. So anyway, he traded those three players and he got back about six. He traded those three players and a couple of like mediocre type players, and he got back like 7 or 8 players in return, and his team was really balanced. Anyway, maybe I shouldn't have helped him that much in brokering a trade, because he started he won like 4 in a row after that. And then he almost, he made the playoffs from that one trade, and he actually almost ran the table. And he actually, believe it or not, at the end of the season, winded up with the most points for. And it all stemmed from that. So I don't want to hear people say, I don't trade Antonio Brown or Julio Jones, Shady, or Kamara, or, I don't trade these players. If you're 0-5 with these players, you have 0 wins and 5 losses with these players, you could be 0-5 without these players. There's obviously, if you have 3 of the top players and you're losing, there's obviously something wrong with your team. And you can't fall in love with your players. This is the biggest mistake in fantasy football. People, I can't trade Kamara, I can't trade, Zeke Elliott. Maybe this year you can, but, I can't trade Antonio Brown. He's Antonio Brown. And yes, you can. There's a player in our league, that held on to Le'Veon Bell for almost 10. By the time he plays, it's going to be week 11. Who knows what type of shape he's going to be in? I tried to get this player from him because I was going to stash him for the playoffs. And I offered him for formidable players that were currently able to be used. And he didn't do it. And, Bell may have no fantasy relevance whatsoever this year, because, they're going to want to play Connor. A, he deserves it. B, Bell, and I love the Steelers, but, he's in doing what he's doing, and I understand what he's doing. He's also alienating his entire team. They may not play him as much as, he wants to be played. He's gone at the end of the year anyway. And so they're going to want to showcase Connor still, because he's doing well. When Bell comes back, who knows what kind of shape this guy's in? It may take him a few weeks to even get into the season. He's not going to play to week 11 anyway. So trade Bell. If you have Bell on your team, trade him, because you might get 2 really good players for him. And Bell may never play. In some ways you want to hold on to Bell, but if you have a deep team, but if you have if you have a really deep team, you may want to, hold on to Bell if you have a good record or something like that. But if you don't have a good record, and you're starving to get into the playoffs and you have Bell on your bench, trade him, what other players now? You got DeAndre Hopkins, great player, but he's injured. A lot of people don't realize that he's that injured, and the quarterback has been suffering through injuries, and it's a good time, in my opinion, to unload Hopkins. Hopkins may bounce back, but, their quarterback, Deshaun Watson, he just doesn't look like himself. He must be injured. I don't even know what the injury is with Hopkins. Is it his heel or his ankle, something like that? Foot injuries, I think it might be his heel. Foot injuries are really tough injuries for wide receivers. Obviously. But he has a great name, and you might be able to get a lot for him. So you have, Thielen, Kamara. Kamara, looking worse and worse with Kamara with the timeshare. Might be a good time to unload him before he has another mediocre week or 2 and his trade stock goes down. But there's no such thing as there's a player you can't trade, okay? You can't fall in love with your players in fantasy football. You just cannot fall. I can't say that enough. You cannot fall in love with your players in fantasy football. Okay, there's no such thing as an untradeable player. If you could trade an unbelievable superstar on your team and get two excellent players in return that give you better balance for your team, that is the right move. Because sometimes that one player may not be on a bye, but maybe he's going up against Ramsey on the Jaguars, which basically means he's going to have a terrible week anyway, and you could put two players in. It just makes sense. It's amazing how many people in fantasy football do not understand that. I don't mean to insult anyone, but two excellent players, okay, in my opinion, is better than a superstar. If it gives you better balance for your team. If you already have great balance on your team and you have a strong bench and you're like in first place, then I wouldn't trade the superstar, because that's taking a risk, an unnecessary risk. You don't need to do that. And it's always better to get tons of points in one slot than two slots. But if it's two excellent players and you're on the border making the playoffs, whatever the case may be, trade that superstar for two excellent players. And I notice I said excellent. I didn't say very good, like pretty good player, two pretty good players for a superstar. You never do that. Even if they're almost very good players, two of them for a superstar, you don't do that. But if they're two really excellent players for a superstar, you do it. Like, for example, Sanders is putting up, 22, 24 points for the Broncos every week. He's putting up numbers in the 20s because they're also handing the ball off to him on power sweeps and things like that. And he's involved in the offense. I think he even does some punt returns or something like that. He's just involved, and he catches short passes, long passes. He's the dump off guy over the middle. I mean, that's what you want to do, and he's in, Jeffrey's, when Jeffrey's playing, he's putting up in the 20s. So, Thielen's putting up 24, 22, 28, 22, 24. But Sanders and Jeffrey are putting up in the 20s too. And there's two of those guys. So it just makes sense. Their numbers, the last few weeks are very comparable to Thielen's. So to get two players that are putting up almost the same numbers as Thielen, for Thielen, it's a smart play, okay? It's using your brain, which is important in fantasy football. But anyway, that's the best way to do draft. Another tactic, which a lot of people don't like, but I've been very effective in doing it, is sometimes it's good to offer a 3 for 2 or a 2 for 1. And I know you're going to say, I hate trading, 2 players to get 3 players in return because I love my bench and I love my starting roster. No, you don't. Because every year I look at someone's roster and I see 1 or 2 players on their bench that shouldn't even be on their team. And I'm just like, that's a wasted, bench spot. And they're just hoping that guy, comes around, or, at some point they're just stashing them on, every team has 1 or 2 stashes on their bench. I mean, wouldn't you like to at least get, a power player in the now? 3 players and unload 2 and then dump that stash for a player that is currently doing well and can help your team right now. It just makes sense, to do. And as far as your bench is concerned, you shouldn't be carrying 2 kickers or 3 quarterbacks or 3 tight ends, or anything like that, because that's just a waste of space on your team. But I can't tell you how many times people say, I hate, Dean, when you send me 2 players for 1 and I have to drop a player, or you send me 3 players for 2. But they do the trade anyway, because a lot of times, let's say I'm stacked at running back. I give them 2 running backs and a wide receiver because I'm stacked at running back for, let's say, 2 receivers or a running back and a wide receiver, and they're actually getting the better end of the deal because that extra, player I'm giving them doesn't suck. I make sure like the players I'm giving are better. But if I have already, extra running backs on my team, I could give away an extra running back. It doesn't matter, even if he's pretty good. If I'm stacked at wide receiver on my team and my bench is stacked, I could give up 2 wide receivers for 1 wide receiver, giving the other team more balance on their team to decent, wide receivers for, a receiver in return, or two, pretty good wide receivers for a running back in return, and it looks like they're getting the better end of the deal. And in some ways, it's making their team stronger. Like, I just did a trade with somebody where their team actually got a little bit stronger, but my team got a lot stronger in the trade, okay? Because I filled a void that was basically vacant before, whereas this person slightly improved one position. So this team slightly improved, that I traded with, slightly improved their team, and their team got stronger. However, my team went from being, let's say, at an 8, and it went to a 10 because I had a pretty good, positions at wide receiver, but now I have great. I made a huge jump. So he made a little jump, and I made a huge jump. And this is a team that's in first place with the highest points for, which means I actually weakened his team against mine. And that's what you want to do, His team got a little stronger. My team got a lot stronger. So although, he was good before, he got a little, I made up ground on him overall because I filled a bigger void on my team where he was just improving his team a little bit, So I saw his team. I said, he drafted really well. I'll tell you, the guy's got like Gurley and, all these great players, in the draft, drafted well. But I looked at his team. I said, you know what? If I don't improve my team against his team, I have no chance of catching him, and you have to be honest with yourself with that. So the only way, he had incredible aerial attack. So the only way I could improve his team is to give him, make one of his wide receiver positions stronger, and one of his slightly stronger, and one of his running back positions slightly stronger, but take away from his depth at wide receiver. Because what happens is anytime he had a bad matchup, he just put in the extra excellent wide receiver, he had on the bench, but he's not going to be able to do that now. And if there's an injury, he loses a wide receiver. If there's, a bye week, he loses a wide receiver. If he's in a tough matchup that week, he loses wide receiver, and he cannot replace with a powerhouse guy off his bench like before. So I actually gained ground on him because now my wide receiver core is strong, and I have an extra slot on my bench, which actually made my bench stronger too. So I gained ground on this person. I don't know if I'll, make the playoffs and, win it all, but I was humble with myself, and I said, if I don't catch this guy and make up some ground, he's going to run away with this tournament. And he still may, because there's still some, luck involved, but at least I gave myself a fighting chance. Another thing you may want to do, it is fantasy football and it's competition, is sometimes look at your bye weeks. If you have 3 guys in your bye weeks coming up against a player, and it's the second half of fantasy football, and you're going to lose those 3 players that week, and he has 3 starters that week, and you're playing against him, you might want to unload those 2 or 3. I'm saying if it's close to you getting into the playoffs or not, and you're down to the last 5 or 6 games of the season in fantasy football and you need a win, the last thing you need is to lose 3 players in a week when you're fighting to get into the playoffs. So what you might want to do, because once you're in the playoffs, anything could happen. You might want to do a trade in the coming weeks, which I've done many times, where players think they're getting the better end of the deal, but what they don't realize is I just traded them 2 or 3 players, and I'm going to play them in week 11 or 12 when it's going to really count, and I'm fighting to get into the playoffs. And I have 3 players on a bye that week, and I'm playing that person that I just gave him those 3 players, and he gave me 3 players back in return. And in week 11, I'm going to gain 3 players that are not going to be on a bye week, and he's going to lose 3 players that are on a bye week. That's a 6-player trade. I just bought myself a victory that week. And that's how you have to think in fantasy football, because I have 3 players, he has 3 players on the bench, and now has to, replace. I'm not going to lose 3 players. I'm going to gain 3 players, and he's going to lose 3 top players, and now he has to replace them. That's almost guaranteed. That's almost a guaranteed win. And when it comes to the last half of the season, guaranteed wins are really important. And that's how you have to look at things when, you trade. Sometimes people trade with me and they're not even looking at that. And they're like, oh, I'm doing this trade. I'm getting all these players and I'm getting the better end of the deal. But that person doesn't realize is they basically did get the better end of the deal, but they're going to lose to me in 3 weeks, which was the whole reason why I made the trade, because those wins at the end of the season could be the difference between you getting into the playoffs and losing the playoffs. So, yeah, that player got these great players, but he's going to lose to me in 3 weeks. And knowing I'm going to get that win, I might be able to finagle another win or 2 inside of those weeks, knowing that that week is already taken care of, So these are fantasy football strategies, things that you should consider. This is Fantasy Football RSVP. We're a new channel. We also have a chat room website, which I just started, Fantasy Football RSVP. If you'd like to join, or not, it's up to you. You could certainly send me an email. Just, send a friend request on Facebook. But, also write a message, because I'm not going to just accept anyone. Tell me who you are. Make sure like you're a real person. This way everyone in there is real. But it could be really great to have a chat room, and I'm surprised there aren't more chat rooms like this, where people from many different leagues can go and talk about their lineups back and forth and that sort of thing. So I'd like to, grow it, and I'm going to be starting a podcast as well, so you could get more live videos like this. You could also subscribe. It's up to you. But this is Dean Curry, Fantasy Football RSVP. Have a terrific day and a successful season in fantasy.